Welcome, let's talk about serial killers. My name is Sheesh Merriweather and I'm the founder of Crime Viral Online. Today I'll be doing what I do best, which is talking about serial killers. Most people are like, you're fascinated with true crime, you're not into or obsessed with serial killers, are you? And inside the minds of them. I'm like, no, I'm more into inside the minds of uninsured drivers. Yes, serial killers, of course. So today's episode is going to be 3 types of mothers most likely to raise a killer. Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, director of Birmingham City University's Centre for Applied Criminology, outlined in an article for the Huffington Post the 3 types of mothers most likely to raise future serial killers. She explained, I argue that mothers matter more than fathers in the making of murderers because of the inherently gendered nature of society. We expect mothers to be selfless nurturers and primary caregivers, expectations we take for granted and apply to all. We defer to mothers simply by assuming that they know best and prioritise the needs of their child, protecting them from harm both within and outside the family. Yet mother doesn't always know best. Yardley examined many cases including Fred and Rose West, Harold Shipman, Dennis Nilsson, Robert Black and Richard Kalinsky, who were all raised by a particular type of mother whose parenting technique contributed to a later violent streak that led to the tragic loss of many lives. The 3 types are Auntie Mothers, Uber Mothers and Passive Mothers. We will examine each type in detail here. Auntie mothers are often the victims of abuse and neglect themselves and have also suffered a brutal upbringing. Yardley said they turn from victims of brutalization to ruthless aggressors, the same kind of aggressors they once despised. Yet not all mothers who suffered an abusive childhood will end up recycling this negative behavior. This will depend on how highly they rate on the empath to narcissist scale. When it comes to empaths or narcissists who have suffered trauma, depending on how they process the pain and who they identify with will later determine their reaction. Empaths identify with the victim. They could not imagine inflicting the kind of pain they suffered themselves on anyone else. Whereas on the opposite end of the scale, narcissists identify with the predator and they end up re-traumatizing others and continuing this cycle of dysfunction. In the case of anti-mothers, they are on the narcissistic side of this scale. They turn on the victims in their home, often smaller children, to continue the same kind of behavior they once despised of in these aggressors. Let's look at Richard Kalinsky, for example. His mother Anna had suffered a traumatic upbringing herself. She was raised in an orphanage after her parents emigrated from Dublin in 1904. Anna's father died of pneumonia and her mother was hit by a truck. She was beaten by sadistic nuns who raised her, and also alongside her siblings they were left terribly malnourished. Anna later met Stanley Kalinsky, a Polish immigrant, and based on the photo of their wedding day, they looked like a happy, well-matched couple. They raised their family in New Jersey, however they were both abusive to their own children. At home, a young Richard received many brutal beatings from both of his parents. His mother would either turn a blind eye to the violence in the family home, she herself trying to avoid the violence being directed at her, or she administered the beatings herself. Kalinsky described his own mother as cancer, someone who raised 2 killers, himself and his older brother. In 1970, his older brother Joseph was 25 years old when he lured a 12-year-old girl to her death by stealing her pet dog. When the girl followed him to a desolate rooftop, Joseph attacked and murdered her before throwing her lifeless body and the dog from the roof. This account of his childhood is laid bare in the account of the Iceman Confessions of a Mafia Hitman. In the book, it reads, he often wondered why his mother didn't like him, what he had done to deserve her indifference and this violence. He drew further and further into himself and was always alone. He couldn't seem to make friends. A seething, fiery rage grew inside the small boy. Aged 13 years old, a teenage Kalinsky was tall but frail for his age and often bullied by the other boys. He then beat to death a teenage boy named Charlie Lane, who was the leader of a small gang. This was the first murder at his own hands. Later in life, he became a serial killer associated with the crime families of New Jersey and with the crime families of New York City. Kalinsky presented himself as a hard-working businessman. He was a doting father and a loving husband. Yet in reality, he was torturing, dismembering and disposing of victims only hours after fixing toys for his own children. Being able to do this meant he could compartmentalize his own sinister crimes in his mind, likely stemming from the abuse he suffered himself throughout his childhood. Next is Uber mothers. Uber mothers come from a relatively stable upbringing in what often would be described as a traditional family environment. However, from an early age, they've developed an acute awareness of what is expected from a family in the eyes of society. They will therefore not allow their own children to be held back by restrictive labels such as illegitimacy, poverty, or minority. They will do anything to protect their child from scrutiny, including covering up certain behaviours that have become increasingly deviant. They also have a tendency for micromanaging their own children. So next we will take a look at the upbringing of Ted Bundy, a serial killer who I am sure you are familiar with and probably guessed who I was going to talk about next when I mentioned the word illegitimacy. In November 1946, at a home for unwed mothers, Louise Cowell gave birth to Theodore Robert Bundy, a good 400 miles away from her own family home. So basically this was kept secret. She later said that Ted's father was a World War II veteran who romanced her, she fell pregnant, and then he abandoned her. His name was left off the birth certificate. There were many close family members who were interviewed after Bundy's arrest. And an aunt of his told investigators that there was a lot of suspicion within the family that his grandfather was in fact his real biological father, although that was never proven. To avoid the shame and stigma of illegitimacy, Bundy's mother passed him off as her baby brother. But he himself only discovered this when he was older, looked at his birth certificate and he had no named father. How frustrated and confused must you be throughout childhood if you just found out that your mother was pretending to be your sister your entire life? Later, Bundy shared with a girlfriend that he was angry at his mother because she never had the decency to tell him herself. Yet his mother was acting like an Uber mother would do. She was protecting her child from social stigma, yet her protectiveness in the form of dishonesty backfired. Also, Uber mothers are described as having the capacity for covering up for a child's deviant behaviours that should otherwise be addressed. Polly Nelson wrote the book Defending the Devil. She was the defence attorney whose job it was to keep Bundy out of the electric chair. She wanted to find something in Bundy's childhood that might point to the origins of mental disorder, but she had a tough job on her hands because remember, this is an incredibly closed off and private family who do not share their intimate secrets. She did, however, discover one incident in the serial killer's childhood that is quite frankly disturbing. She writes, Ted had come back to stay with his aunt whilst he was a young boy. She recalled that at the age of 3 years old, Ted was discovered slipping butcher knives into the bed of the sleeping teenager. She awoke with amazement and told Ted's mother, but Ted's mother denied there had been any problems. That particular incident is just a start of a long history of fear Bundy would have inflicted on females throughout his life. Uber mothers who bury their head in the sand when this type of behaviour takes place may pass off this dismissiveness as unconditional love, he's just a child. However, when a 3-year-old is using butcher knives from the kitchen drawer to scare his teenage aunt as she's sleeping, this is an excellent opportunity to intervene and teach the child empathy. Studies show that around 2 years of age, children start to show genuine empathy, understanding how people feel. Not only do they feel another person's pain, but they should try and soothe it. This is an emotional developmental milestone that was never achieved by Bundy. Later on death row, he said, "What I lacked and didn't understand and express was love. By love, I mean the ability to sense someone else's feelings. when to comfort them and when to protect them, and do good things for them. There is no way you can hurt someone, physically kill someone, if you're a loving person. I mean truly loving. Bundy was executed for his crimes in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. His mother did not attend the execution. She instead made one last phone call to her son, and her final words, recorded by the prison system, were, "You'll always be my precious son." So for these Uber mothers whose love is unconditional, maybe, especially if your son is Ted Bundy, there should be some clear conditions for that love. Finally, we have passive mothers. Passive mothers fear the judgment that society may impose on their children. These mothers have lived out their lives following the rules, not crossing the lines, fulfilling social expectations. They have always been quiet, passive, and just ticking along. Yardley explained, therefore, when their children begin to cross society's moral and legal boundaries, the fear of labelling compels them to respond in the only way they know. Denial, inaction, sweep it under the carpet, it will go away. It's a phase, they will grow out of it. Which brings me next to the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. Serial killer and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer admitted to killing 16 men. He decapitated, dismembered and defleshed them, and then threw whatever was left either in the trash, stored them in the shower where he washed, or chose to freeze some of the parts in his fridge at home. His descent to darkness began from a very young age. He was 4 years old when he became completely fascinated with the bones of dead animals, and his father taught him how to use a chemical solution so these bones will be stripped clean of flesh. Also age 4, young Jeffrey had a double hernia operation on his groin, a procedure that would be terrifying for any adult, let alone a small child. The operation was never fully explained to him. He recalls waking from the anaesthetic and all he was aware of was this intense pain in his groin. Pain so intense that at the time he believed the doctors had cut his genitals off. Jeffrey said it was an experience he never forgot. He then began to distrust those around him and withdrew further into his own little world. Aged 6 years old, he killed some tadpoles by pouring motor oil into the water because his teacher, who he had gifted them to, had re-gifted them to another pupil. He then turned to impaling scores of animals on little crosses in the neighbourhood. This was witnessed by the children who grew up with him. Passive parenting, often also known as permissive parenting, is a particular parenting style that allows a child a lot of freedom, few boundaries, or little to no discipline. These are all behaviours which, if acknowledged earlier on in childhood, can derail them from heading further down the wrong path. However, there was so much tension in the Dahmer family home that these behaviours were hugely overlooked. There is a very thorough account of Jeffrey Dahmer's childhood in the book by his father, Lionel Dahmer, A Father's Story. Despite these early warning signs in childhood, his mother Joy still continued, even after her son's incarceration for some of the most gruesome crimes in history, to ignore the elephant in the room, that her son's upbringing was not all that great. In an interview with Stone Phillips in 1994, Joy said there was no physical abuse in the house, but often emotional abuse is just as detrimental to a child. She then, during the interview, becomes irate with Phillips when it's suggested she might have had a part to play in her son's emotional aloofness. The facts are, she did have a hand in raising one of the most prolific cannibalistic serial killers the world has ever seen, so maybe a little bit of responsibility lies for that in her own hands. Let me simplify that. If your young son is impaling skulls on little crosses, collecting roadkill, and also killing tadpoles with motor oil, it's your responsibility as a parent to step in and be like, no, young Jeffrey, find a better hobby. Because then by the time you're writing the book, Where Did It All Go Wrong?, it's a little bit too late. So that's the 3 types of mothers that are most likely to raise cold-blooded killers. If you'd like to join us and continue this conversation further, we'll be over at Facebook at Crime Viral. Like, subscribe to this channel, and also feel free to pop a comment down below.